interested to know, you were mentioning about standardizing data or something like that. And I'm looking from the perspective of clinical workflows. For example, a clinical workflow in North America is different from the clinical workflow in Europe, for example.
Yeah, it's
covering that, what range?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Oh, the question was about what was the question again? It was about workflow. Am I looking at the differences in workflows in different countries, for example? Very interesting question, because one of the things I've been doing lately is started some consulting with hospitals about buying patient record systems. And a lot of hospitals will tell you things are fine, but they're really disasters. They're not implemented. They bought a system 4 years in, it's still not running. And when I go in and I work with them, so I know it's not the outside story. I won't say who they are, though. They won't work with me anymore. But what I found was there were serious problems with these systems dealing with workflow. Two things I found. One was workflow. One was because the commercial vendors who make these systems, maybe in Nebraska or somewhere in the States, they base the requirements often on very lean requirements gathering, like 1 or 2 physicians, a few experts, non-representative people, or not even that, although they spend millions of dollars to make the system, and they base it on the workflow from there, and then they come to Canada or some other country and say, this will work perfectly for you. And a lot of the usability problems I'm seeing in the hospitals are related to things like not just the interface, but just the whole procedure of doing everything is so far off in the EMR system that it's not even customizable very well to what they're doing here. And there's classic cases of that. For example, they developed some system in the US. There was one paper on, and they sent it to Australia, and it didn't work at all, or England. And it's very different from what the salespeople will say. So that's a very... I've looked at workflow. I have some other studies that are more observational, looking at... I had some students working with something, BPR, Business Process Reengineering software, where you can diagram the workflow, which is a very good area to get into, because in healthcare, I don't know a lot of people using that. In the business area, they use it a lot. And you can use that to map out and then compare to, say, how the system does it. So that's a very good area.
If we go back to the point to discuss about EHR or electronic health record, if we try to connect 2 cities, as you mentioned, city X with city Y, and we try to transfer this data and records, who is the owner of the patient record? Is it the hospital where the patient comes from, or is it Canada Health, or is it...
Okay, question was, yeah, who owns the data if you transfer the data? Well, that's a thorny question. It also, I think, relates to whether it's US or Canada. Well, it's the physician's data, but it's within that hospital. So as far as I know, it's the hospitals. Is that, maybe you would know, Dominique?
It is a legal jurisdictional.
Jurisdictional, yeah. It varies.
Yeah, and who has access this data? Is it just the family physician, or?
Well, that again depends. For example, in a hospital, other physicians may need to access that record. And this is another, relating it to patient record issue that I'm looking at, is that when you start automating things, before the actual record, say, in an ICU would be on a paper table, and people could come in if there's an emergency, the nurse who may not be able to access it could pull it out and then, save the patient at the last minute. A lot of these systems now are putting in explicit blocks on different users. And I don't think they're based too much on policy. I'm not sure what they're based on. It's like the designers saying, or talking to the 1 or 2 doctors they talk to, saying, so-and-so should see this or not that. And that can create a lot of problems, because if there's not a clear policy on access, but even if there is, by making things electronic, you may block the information from other people when they need it. So you often need to have then, I've seen papers on algorithms for breaking the rules. Very interesting question, yeah.
Other questions or comments on? Anything to say, Jose? Hand up your butt.
I sort of have a more philosophical question. You seem like you've been intending to move into this web-based usability area. And could you just comment on, there's like 2 roles a usability person could play, and both are more in the scientific kind of lab code area, but there is a role in usability engineering of just anthropologists sort of watching, being observational. You spoke to that in the initial conversation.
Yep.
What do you think about that? I mean, that aspect of it is much more difficult to do. You said you could do a lot more with the database and the searches and sort of the data mining aspect. But there is something that you're going to lose. Can you speak?
Okay, so the question was about that if you're looking at, there's ethnographic or observational data is one type of data, and then there's the kind of data I've collected with logging in that.
By analyzing the web-based system remotely, you're
losing a lot of information. Well, what I try to do is always the best that I can. If I'm actually doing a study remotely, say a usability test remotely, and I've actually done this where you can log in someone else on your screen using certain tools and see what they're doing. Oftentimes I've actually sent them webcams. Again, it depends what you want. If I'm doing a study where I only need to look at the screen, because I just to think aloud, I don't need a person, then I just directly record it. In the studies where I needed the interaction, often they would move to a room where I would do a simulation. And that to me actually didn't require $1 million laboratory, because you could still go into some room like an education room with ceiling mounted cameras and do that. Depends what I'm looking for. So a lot of what I got in my studies for projects I was doing to improve usability and also for theoretical issues came from limited recording. But again, once you start looking at aspects of how a unit works, how do you record that information? So you can't obviously have cameras everywhere, but I'm doing some with PDAs now where we have automatic logging of what they're doing on the PDA. I would like to do full screen monitoring of what they're clicking on the PDA, but haven't figured a way how to do that yet because you can't beam that yet, but once you can, I'm going to be doing that. So I use whatever technology is possible. But yeah, you do get limits when you want to look at the actual physical work of everyone on a unit. Other methods I've used, whatever worked. I've walked around with the microphone on rounds to collect data on what they're saying rather than making notes. I'm much more into trying to get the real data, but whatever method works and whatever you can get approval to use without being too obtrusive.
Yeah, this might actually wind up being a whole other talk, but I know you've presented a lot of information on how it is that users interact with the system. You know, saying what they should have been, but how do you sort of take it to the next level and say, well, what you really should have done? Because a lot of times they have a specific workflow or, you know, the way that they like to dictate their notes or whatever, but it's not always necessarily correct. They could be trained to do it another way.
Yes.
So how do you mesh the two? How do you say, this is what we found that they were doing, and that's why they don't like your software?
Yep.
How do you make it right, or is it a combination?
The question is that, I think the question is that people may be doing it a certain way, and then if you might say to change the way they're doing, but there may be a way to change it that they don't like, but it might be more efficient, for example. So the question, I think, relates to who do you change? What I do is I just analyze the situation. And then after you analyze it, you have to ask the question of what and who do you change? Do you change the system, or do you change the user? Do you change both? And if you change the user, then you get into training. Can you do it in a way that they'll adopt the system before dropping it? So I think it's really important to think that you shouldn't always have to change the user. Or that you may want to change the user. You shouldn't always have to, have the user adopt or not adopt. That you may want to change their behavior. That there may be a better way to do it. An example was the first patient record I showed was trying to make it. It wasn't really, but it was trying to make a paper scroll, because the people at that point said, "Let's make the interface like a paper so that they like writing," and that was less efficient than making them go into the other one I showed where they click on menus, which was a change in what they did, but people adopted it better because it just suited the media of a computer better. So I think it's an interesting question, and too often people will just dictate changes to people, and it should be really looked at as whether the system needs changing. But the one thing I will say is most developers don't really take much into account about how their, for example, layout on the screen is going to affect somebody. It's often very haphazard.
How often you actually get to follow it through, like make recommendations to change in this way, and then find out afterwards, did they like it a lot better, was it more useful, did it serve them better?
Yes, well that's one of the points about the usability life cycle, and what you want to do, and then this becomes an issue of practicality when you're working with organizations developing software, because often they'll tell me, you can't do iterative cycles, it's too expensive, but I'll say, if you don't do them, the result that's useless is too expensive, and you have to redo the whole thing again, and it takes longer. But given that, you want to have usually, I've worked with companies in that, where there's usually 3 or 4, up to 3, maybe 4 cycles of that iteration during the design phase, not sort of this design where you don't talk to users. And then at the end of each cycle, you make the changes based on what you found from the evaluation, and then you do another one. So then you can see, you can actually chart about maybe, hopefully, errors going down. And usually, if you use that rational process, you will see a very steep decline in errors. But you're always open to the chance that maybe you made a change that causes something else. So usually, you need 3 cycles minimum, I found. But most companies don't even do that. Yes?
Maybe drawing on your experience of consulting with hospitals, could you comment on what importance are hospitals putting on issues of human factors and ease of use before they actually make the commitment to purchase these?
Oh, the question is, what extent are hospitals and organizations putting into considering usability in that before they make the decision to purchase? That's a really interesting question. Another study I'm looking at is how they make the decisions. Because being in consulting, I've often seen, being at hospitals, when the consultants came in, they would show some systems, and when you asked them about why they picked those, there wasn't any clearness. It didn't look like they'd actually looked at the requirements of that place. So in a few cases, I've actually asked one case experimented. They hadn't signed for it. It was in the U.S. It was going to be a $5 million contract for a hospital. And I said, well, you hold the key here. Don't sign for it until you ask them to bring the product in, and let's do some head-to-head usability on it. And the company came back, the consultant came back from the company very upset because they said, no one asked this. This is not done. We demo and you buy. And this is the state of the art. And the CIOs, same thing. They don't look into it very much. And so we said no. And then they came back and said, well, the problem is that setting up a test database would be $100,000. We said no. Eventually they came in with a test database. And then they said the demoer will show it to us. And I said, no, we don't want the demoer there when we do it. So it's a major issue. The decisions made, I've seen often leave a lot to be desired. There's a lot of pressures for an organization to buy a system. If they don't buy a system, people will be in trouble because they know they have to move to it. If they buy one and don't check it out, but the way that the buying process is done, with the vendors coming in, the demos, and often decisions made by people that haven't analyzed it. I've often said to organizations, if you're going to buy a very large contract, maybe get a subsystem for a clinic first, and then get some track record with them on whether they will customize it, whether it works at all, or anything on that as a baseline before committing millions of dollars that you can't roll back. Because once you've committed that, the hospitals can't turn them back, even if they're still having trouble implementing the system several years after purchase. So unlike most well, there are examples of this in business. I've also looked at ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning Systems. And I thought I was looking for other examples of sometimes buying these monster systems that can be very problematic, and they're all over in business. It's not just patient records, but they're a good example of.
Other comments? You talk about usability testing. Did you include in your testing current systems, several systems, one system? What type of system do you use?
Oh, for the testing that what type of systems have I tested? It really ranged. Like, those were just some examples. That first one was sort of educational decision support. I've done quite a few patient record systems now. Then moved on to looking at things like web-based guidelines, web-based information resources, and also been doing a lot lately. I have several projects with PDAs, looking at handheld devices, both for usefulness for clinical guidelines like drug information, with the UHN and Bell Labs at the University of Toronto. And another one I'm doing with Mount Sinai, where we're looking at prescription entry and errors introduced by handhelds. So the whole other area I've got into, paper coming up in MedInfo, is one was looking at usability of PDAs. All we did was a study where we asked 10 doctors to enter prescriptions that were on paper into the PDA, about an hour's worth each. And then I coded it for usability problems based on their interaction. And it come up with about 300 usability problems coded overall. And then I had a medical person code it for actual errors in medication. And there were about 60. So just transcribing, there were 60. And you could actually use the usability category to predict the error. When defaults often created a problem. If there's a problem with the default, then often they wouldn't change it. Next time they'd do milligrams when it shouldn't be. There were problems with display visibility, and each of those problems had a percent sort of chance from the data that I had of predicting an error, actual error in the data entry. So somebody that reviewed that said, well, you didn't really train that. That was a common prescription writing program that they use in hospitals. A lot of doctors like using. And they said, you didn't train them on that, but these were all PDA users, and you don't have training sessions on a $100 program. You have a learning curve. So at the very least, during the learning curve, I was looking at the introduction of errors from the technology. The reason being is that a lot of people now are saying, that there's errors in medicine, the technology will improve it. That's the answer. And my argument is the technology isn't one technology, and there's the usability is on a huge range, and that's why usability will be important, because there isn't such thing as one system. There's many systems, and some have poor usability, will introduce errors, others will improve errors. So that's another area I've gotten into with the usability is on the errors. That's the errors and the web stuff. Yes. Yes.
One of your studies, I think you said you went from paper to computer-based, and then some went back to paper again. Can you explain, or what happened when they went back to paper?
Oh, okay. That was back on a study that was done in late 90s, and we were looking at when they went back to paper what they would do, and a lot of them ended up adopting the same still sort of had a residual use of the of that style of interacting, and some of them actually even included the same kind of charting or template. They did it by hand. But even if they didn't, we found that they still had a change in the way that they interacted with the patient that was a bit residual. And looked at that over 6 months, didn't look at it longer than that. So it seemed like there was some, even after they removed from the computer, that there had been change. The other issue is if you have doctors that are trained to do medicine a certain way and then use patient records for a long time, and then you take the computer system away, what happens? Or another alternative is that you just change the patient record they're using, how much carries over, and how much maybe de-skilling might occur with these systems. Yes?
Do your clients tend to be more healthcare institutions or private?
I work with mostly on, the people I work with are the hospitals or healthcare or commercial. I do research, so I have research grants with universities, hospitals. That's my mainstay. But I always have at least one project or two projects going with commercial vendors. I'm doing one right now with a company that does dental and medical records, and have students working on that. But it's also input for the company for their product, because hospitals are very good too, because you know at least what you're looking at is being used. So some of the earlier ones I did, like at Columbia, were very nice because they developed it there, but 5,000 doctors use it. So you're not doing an artificial study no one uses. Other times I'm working with small companies. That was a small company back then. I've since worked with about 5 or 6 small companies, and I'm currently working with them because it gives you a reality check on what's out there. And from what I've seen in the small companies, the usability thing, in fact, now they're beginning to approach me because they know that some of the companies had good products, but their interfaces are so bad that they're losing market share very quickly.
What level at the hospital engages you? Is it at department level, or is it?
It depends on the project. It could be a research project at a department level, or it could be some other. With some of the places, because I did a research project in that hospital, they knew what I was doing, and then I ended up asking for some help from CIOs for particular things like purchases.
I guess my question is leading to who cares about it more? Is it the CIO, CXO level, or is it?
Well, often I found that the informatics groups, nursing informatics groups, clinical informatics groups, are very concerned about their products that they make in-house or customized. They don't want them not to work, and they know there's problems. So they're very much into trying to get outside evaluations. And even at the top, people are very interested too. So I found at all levels, and even at the level of the individual doctors that wanted to just be subjects for a study, even if the clinic didn't want to be, because they realized it was important. So buy-in on this finally from all levels.
Doctors are notoriously busy. Did you encounter any challenges in recruiting people?
Well, it depended. Were there problems in recruiting doctors because they're busy? It depended a lot on the type of study. If it was a study with a hospital and it's academic, usually you try to get a collaborator who's pretty high up in the hospital or runs the unit or whatever. So when he goes, I mean, it's not exactly random sampling. You can never do it if you're trying to get real data. But if someone's in charge of the unit and then he nabs a few residents, they'll do it. Other types of things, if it's through a company recruited through paying them, but then how would they even be interested because they can make a lot of money per hour? But in one case, I'm working with a company where they have a user group coming in because they're learning how to use the system, and we've asked them at the end of the sessions would they stay on for some usability testing at $100 or $200 an hour. But we piggybacked on that. So it really depended. And then other people were really concerned about interfaces in hospitals, if not their own, and have volunteered just because of that.
Any others? I have a quick comment. I think the microphone will work here. A quick comment and then a question. One comment is work that we did showed that in the systems in hospitals, and particularly departmental systems, a very small part of the functionality of systems was ever used. And typically less than 25% in a diagnostic imaging department. It would seem to be almost a good idea if vendors built in some basic level of recording, so like a black box recorder where they could even begin to assess the use of their products, because people come to the point they say, well, this system's garbage, and you say to them, but you've never used 75% of the functionality. Have any companies ever talked to you about that idea of a...
Well, that's a good point. Not really. Most hospital units spend a lot of time not making their own product, but customizing. And they still use standard techniques of interviewing people saying, what do you want on the screen? But if you're customizing, actually... But as I said, interviews often don't relate to what people really do. If you were to base the customization on an analysis of the logging, you might get a better customization. I haven't really worked with anyone who's thought to do that during the customization process. But that would be another use of this information.
Even before customization, during normal running, the operating time of the thing, just to periodically evaluate the use, how high level of use there is of the system.
Yeah, I've worked with some that have, done function usage to see, but again, usually they just got the data, and it didn't really pipeline back into. There'd be nice to have a feed from that into the design of the screens. A lot of hospital people will spend a lot of time designing the screens for nurses or doctors, and it won't be based on a lot of data like what people wanted to use from tracking data. It'll often be done from interviewing one or two experts, which often isn't the best way to proceed.
And this business, too, of users after the fact not reporting what they actually went through. I know of at least one very good study that showed the clinicians, when asked what their diagnostic process was and coming to a conclusion, gave a certain process, but then when followed through observation in what they actually did a completely different process. There was no comparison between the two processes. So there's really a divergence there, and many, many examples of that. The other comment I wanted to make related to this business, a question was asked about the level of activity within institutions related to the human factors and re-engineering and human, I'll call it the whole human side. The experience that we're having, and now a number of meetings, is that's still in the doldrums. There's still very few people convinced that what the evidence says is a requirement for several dollars spent per dollar on the technology, that be spent on training and human resource reorganization, re-engineering. It's still not being done. And no wonder with the technology, they're barely able to afford the technology is the argument. But that is a huge problem that, even with high levels, the only way you'll achieve in some cases high levels of usability is if you do those things. So yours merges well with that, and there's been a lack of evidence out there of that, but more and more economics evidence is coming out. This is yet another potential source of evidence that dictates that additional human capital investment that is necessary, organizational capital investment that's necessary.
Yeah, it's very important because I've tried to work with some companies outside of healthcare. It was much harder to sell. You would tell them that if they don't do this, it's going, their products won't be good. They'll have longer release times. And one brokerage house told me, oh, we don't care. They're all full of bugs anyways. It goes to another department, things like that. And it's shocking in some systems, like the vendors that make the patient record system companies, many of them, I won't say all, often use a traditional life cycle model without doing a lot of iteration. And, or their systems that are commercial are put into a hospital by going away for a few months, getting the specs, and then coming out. And then perpetually, that approach leads to late release times, a system turned off, it released several years later. And yet when you talk to people and say, they're very concerned that your analysis might decrease the speed at which it's released. But I have a point about that is coming up with some kind of a metric about how this may save time. In one study, one organization I worked with said, prove that it works. So it was an order entry system, and we had 9 people just enter into the system information they were taking from paper because they really were moving to the system. Think aloud. I coded it in a week or two to show I could do it quickly. Transcribed it myself too, analyzed the coding, and then made a hit list of what to fix, went back to the developers, and then they made only those changes, and within a month had another 9 come in. And we went from an average of 19 errors to 1.9, and it was unusable before, and we picked off things questionnaires wouldn't get. So they had me coming back for projects. But another company I met did a project. It wasn't in healthcare. They had a project with a company that does high-speed modems. And they did a usability analysis of the instructions for people at home. And they actually had a pre and post, because the company had statistics on how many people could complete doing it at home without calling India or wherever. And it was like 89%. After they did the usability heuristic, it was probably a contract to that company for probably $30,000 or that range. It had gone up to 93% completion. So it was a huge, 4% was huge for this major company, and every time that they had someone call would take on average an hour. So I know that person was advertising what they were doing that way. But it's very hard. It's been an issue of trying to coming up with the actual value in dollars, and people will often say, you know, oh, you can't tell me the value in dollars, it's not valuable. The approach I'm taking now is tying usability to errors, because everyone's on an error bandwagon. And the stuff I'm showing now is showing that for every CPR, it may fix something up, it may cause 10 other things. So if that's the answer to the healthcare system, they'll have to look at usability for safety and litigation reasons.
Yeah, that's going to be a big issue, particularly with Leapfrog pushing that in the United States and the big movement there. Final quick question, I'll give it to Liz after that, is you've done now a lot of work on usability. Can you begin to formulate, I'll call it a high usability model? In other words, a system having the following characteristics, or an interface having the following characteristics, is likely to be more usable.
Yeah, people often ask me about that. I tend to always sort of sit on the fence and say, well, no, I don't know unless I look at the data for that use in that context. But I have found a few principles. With patient record systems, for example, ones that really were designed to fit the metaphor that they, you know, if it's a web-based metaphor, the one I showed you was almost like an Amazon.com. It fit with what people knew and used. There was not much learning curve. When I've seen people take Windows ones and try to port them to the web, it doesn't work. When I saw DOS going, that's one example. There are many examples of sort of specific things I've seen. But often I kind of never answer about in general, because I always sort of try to be experimental and say, well, I don't want to know and I don't want to say anything until I test it.
I expect your real font of knowledge on that. It'd be interesting sometime to have a talk about that.
There also is another area that I draw on for coding and stuff. It's the whole, if you're familiar with Nielsen's heuristics, usability heuristics. They're on the web. They're very simple things. Strive for consistency. My favorite is 5 plus or minus 2 rule. People remember 5 plus or minus 2 things. It's 5 plus or minus 2, right? Yeah, 5 plus or minus 2. It's like telephone numbers. So when you're developing a website, you don't want a menu bar with more than 5 items. If you do, you need to subdivide it. You'd be surprised how many expensive websites were developed, like the York homepage with 50 links on the first page, you know, violating something simple as that. So if people actually did use those heuristics, and the better sites do, that's a predictive or sort of a summary kind of a thing. But even still, I'm very much into never assume what the user would do until testing.
I wanted to comment about what you guys were talking about, who's interested in usability and whatnot. It's not always just company that I happen to know about. It goes into other sites and says, you know, as you're going to be implementing this, before you do it, we believe so strongly that you need to map your processes, current state, future state, that we'll even come and do this for free, because we know it's going to make your success implementing this much, much greater, and they still don't want you to do it.
Yeah.
You've got to make them.
Well,
and it's part of the package we have to come.
Well, that's an interesting story, because I had a student that created his own summer job. He couldn't get one. Took the course on usability analysis, and what he ended up doing was 2 things. One is he went on websites and saw really bad ones. He would do a 1-page sampler analysis and send it to the company, and he got a lot of contracts doing that. The other one he did was different. He just went through the yellow pages of companies that didn't give a URL and figured they probably didn't have a website and they needed one. And he was completely full the whole summer doing that. So it was one of those.
Hello, students are here, please. Other questions or comments? I don't want to leave anybody out. If not, Andre, thank you very much. I know you took a great deal of trouble to get here today. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you. We also have a small gift of our appreciation. You might want to take a look at this. It's the oddest thing you've ever gotten in your life. We claim it's a photograph of the health system, but we think it will draw lots of people. It's by an artist here at the University of Waterloo who donated that to our seminar series. So it'll at least make people look at your little plaque there and say, oh, thank you very much.
I have one other item of business, if I could take a few more minutes of your time. With the people I've worked with, we have a tradition. And that tradition is one of having fun, celebrating wonderful honoring successes, and recognizing significant milestones. So today, we can celebrate finally summer is here, and that we have concluded a great year of seminars, and that we have a significant milestone. So, today is the first birthday of the Waterloo Institute for Health Informatics Research. And Dominic is the heart and soul of that initiative. So, if you could bring down... And Dominic, will you please make a wish on our first anniversary? And I'd like all of us to stay and have a piece of cake and some beverages. So please stick around and share a piece of cake with us.
I wanted to tell you my wish.
Oh, okay. Well, no. If you tell us the wish, then it won't come true.
This might be good too.
Oh.
I wish we could get for a second year.
So one other little piece I should say is that Dominic is on this absolutely incredible, unbelievable diet that none of us would ever wish to want. So we have a little piece of cake for him that he can have. It's no fat, but there is an added... There's something in that cake, Dominic, that you must absolutely have. So, yes, at least you should take a bite of the cake. So, and the clowns on the cake are doesn't really mean anything that there are clowns on the cake. So, anyway, please join us.